In the summer of 1917, a young British officer led 50 men into a desert that military experts said no army could survive, chasing a victory that everyone believed was impossible. What happened next would become one of the most daring raids in military history, and it all began with a man who refused to accept the word no. In 1916, the Great War had spread far beyond the trenches of Europe. The Ottoman Empire had joined Germany and Austria-Hungary, threatening British interests across the Middle East. Egypt and the Suez Canal were vital to Britain. They connected the empire to India and the East. Losing them would be catastrophic. 400,000 British troops were needed just to defend Egypt. The disaster at Gallipoli had drained resources. The siege at Kut in Mesopotamia had ended in humiliating surrender. Something different was needed, something unconventional. The Arabian Peninsula seemed like an unlikely battlefield. Vast deserts stretched between scattered oases and ancient trading towns. Nomadic tribes moved across borders that meant nothing to them. But the British saw opportunity here. The Arabs were restless under Ottoman rule. If they could be convinced to rise up, they might tie down Turkish forces across the region. It would require a special kind of warfare. Not massive armies clashing on open fields, but small raids, sabotage, and constant harassment. It would require someone who understood both worlds. Someone who could bridge the gap between British military thinking and Arab tribal culture. That someone would soon emerge from the most unlikely of backgrounds. Thomas Edward Lawrence was born in Wales on August 16, 1888. He was not a large man, standing only 5 feet 5 inches tall, with fair hair and piercing blue eyes. From childhood, he was fascinated by medieval history and military fortifications. He would bicycle across England and France, sketching castle ruins and studying ancient defenses. At Oxford, he chose military history and strategy as his specialty. He joined the Officers' Training Corps, learning basic soldiering while pursuing his academic interests. But it was archaeology that first brought him to the Middle East. In 1911, he joined excavations at Karkemish in Syria, near the Turkish border. For 3 years, he lived among Arabs. He learned their language, their customs, their way of moving through the desert. He wore their clothes and ate their food. He was an outsider who genuinely tried to understand. That made him rare among Englishmen of his era. When war came in 1914, Lawrence was assigned to military intelligence in Cairo. His knowledge of Arabic and the region made him invaluable. He drew maps, decoded telegrams, and gathered information, but he was restless behind a desk. He believed the Arabs could change the course of the war. He just needed the chance to prove it. In June 1916, Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, proclaimed a revolt against Ottoman rule. His sons led forces against Turkish garrisons throughout the Hijaz region. The British were eager to support this uprising. They sent money, rifles, machine guns, and artillery. They hoped Arab fighters would tie down Ottoman troops needed elsewhere. Lawrence was sent to assess the situation. What he found did not encourage him. The Arab forces were brave, but undisciplined. They fought as individuals, not as coordinated units. Artillery fire scattered them into chaos. A single Turkish company could have defeated thousands. But Lawrence also saw potential. These men knew the desert intimately. They could survive where conventional armies would perish. They could appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish. He found what he was looking for in Faisal, one of Hussein's sons. Faisal was intelligent, charismatic, and willing to listen to unconventional ideas. By late 1916, the revolt was struggling. Turkish forces had pushed Faisal's men back to the coast at Yanbu. Only British warships prevented total disaster. The Arabs needed a victory, something dramatic that would prove the revolt could succeed. Lawrence began to think about the port of Aqaba, far to the north. It would change everything. Aqaba sat at the head of the Red Sea's northeastern finger, surrounded by mountains and desert. It was a small town, but its location made it strategically vital. If the British controlled Aqaba, they could supply the Arab forces directly. they could protect their right flank as they advanced through the Sinai toward Palestine. The Ottomans knew this. They had fortified Aqaba with heavy guns pointing seaward. Any naval assault would face devastating fire. British commanders considered and rejected an attack. The coastal defenses were too strong. The casualties would be too high. But Lawrence looked at the map differently. The Turkish guns faced the sea. They could not turn to face a landward attack. What if an army approached from the desert instead? Military experts dismissed the idea. The Nifud Desert lay between the Arab bases and Aqaba. Temperatures exceeded 120 degrees. There was almost no water for hundreds of miles. No conventional army could survive that crossing. But Lawrence was not thinking of a conventional army. He was thinking of Bedouin raiders who had crossed these deserts for generations. It seemed impossible. That was exactly why it might work. The Turks would never expect an attack from that direction. They would be caught completely by surprise. Lawrence presented his plan to Arab leaders in the spring of 1917. He would take a small force north through the desert, gathering tribal allies along the way. Many thought he was mad. The journey alone would kill most men. And even if they survived, what could a few hundred fighters do against fortified positions? But Lawrence had an answer for that too. He did not need to take Aqaba by force. He needed to make the Turks believe their position was hopeless. For this plan to work, he needed Auda Abu Tayyib. Auda was the most famous warrior of the Hawitat tribe. His name carried weight across the entire region. Stories said Auda had killed 75 men in battle with his own hands. He had been wounded countless times but always survived. Even his enemies spoke of him with respect. Lawrence traveled to meet him. He found an old man with fierce eyes and an even fiercer reputation. Auda listened to the plan. He asked questions about supplies, routes, and timing. Then he agreed to join. With Auda came his warriors, men who knew every well and wadi between the Hejaz and Syria. In early May, Lawrence set out from Waj with fewer than 50 men. The impossible journey had begun. The crossing of the Nifud Desert was brutal beyond description. The sun beat down without mercy, turning the sand into a furnace. Men wrapped their faces against the blowing grit. Camels groaned under their burdens. Water was rationed to a few sips per day. Lawrence pushed himself as hard as anyone. He refused special treatment, sharing the same hardships as the Bedouin fighters around him. They traveled mostly at night when temperatures dropped. During the day, they sheltered in whatever shade they could find, often just the shadow of their own camels. Several men died along the way. Others wanted to turn back. Lawrence urged them forward with promises of glory and gold. He was learning what it meant to lead in the desert. It was not about giving orders. It was about earning respect through shared suffering. The journey took weeks. They moved through landscapes that seemed to belong to another planet, vast empty spaces where nothing lived. But gradually, the worst was behind them. They reached the wells of Wadi Sirhan, where cool water revived men and animals alike. Here they rested and gathered strength. They sent word to allied tribes. The force that would take Aqaba was beginning to assemble. Uniting the desert tribes was as difficult as crossing the desert itself. These were proud peoples with ancient rivalries and competing claims. Lawrence and Auda moved from camp to camp, negotiating with sheiks and elders. They appealed to honor, to faith, to hatred of the Turks. They also appealed to practical interests. British gold could buy weapons and supplies. Victory would bring plunder from Turkish garrisons. Slowly, the force grew. Warriors arrived in small groups, riding across the empty spaces to join the gathering army. They came from the Hawitat, the Ruala, and half a dozen other tribes. Some brought only themselves and a rifle. Others brought entire family groups. Each addition required delicate handling. Old enemies had to be kept apart. Resources had to be shared fairly. Everyone wanted to feel respected. Lawrence watched and learned. He saw how Auda handled disputes with a mixture of force and charm. He understood that these men would follow strength, not rank. By late June, several hundred fighters had assembled. It was not a large army by European standards, but in the desert, speed and surprise mattered more than numbers. They were ready to move toward Aqaba. The final phase was about to begin. The force moved south through Wadi Sirhan, then turned west toward the mountains overlooking Aqaba. They traveled in small groups to avoid detection. Ottoman patrols were active in the area. Discovery would mean disaster. The Turks would reinforce their defenses, and the element of surprise would be lost forever. Lawrence sent scouts ahead to watch for enemy movement. They reported back with information about garrison strengths and patrol schedules. The tension grew with each passing day. Men checked their weapons constantly. Prayers were offered at every stop. Lawrence himself was struggling with more than physical hardship. He knew things that haunted him. Back in London and Paris, diplomats were drawing lines on maps. The Sykes-Picot Agreement had already divided the Middle East into British and French spheres of influence. The independence he promised these fighters might never come. He was asking them to bleed for a cause that his own government might betray. But what choice did he have? The war had to be won first. Everything else would come later. He buried his doubts and focused on the task ahead, one step at a time. First Aqaba, then whatever came next. The mountains grew closer. The final obstacle awaited. On July 2, 1917, the Arab force encountered a Turkish battalion at Abu el-Lisal. The enemy blocked the path to Aqaba. It was the moment of truth. Everything Lawrence had worked for came down to this engagement. The two forces faced each other across rocky ground. The sun blazed overhead. Heat shimmered off the stones. For hours, they exchanged rifle fire without decisive result. Men crouched behind rocks, conserving ammunition. The Turks held strong defensive positions. Then, Auda Abu Tayyib decided to end the standoff. He mounted his horse and called his warriors to follow. 50 horsemen formed up behind him, their robes streaming in the wind. They charged straight at the Turkish lines. Lawrence found himself caught up in the assault. He spurred his camel forward, pistol in hand. The world became a blur of dust, noise, and chaos. The Turkish soldiers broke. They could not stand against mounted warriors crashing into their positions at full speed. When the dust settled, the enemy was shattered. Hundreds were dead or captured. The path to Aqaba lay open. Lawrence later admitted he accidentally shot his own camel during the charge. He was thrown, but survived unhurt. The legend of Abu el-Lisal would grow with each retelling. After Abu el-Lisal, Turkish resistance crumbled rapidly. Small garrisons between the battlefield and Aqaba surrendered or fled when they heard the news. On July 6, 1917, Lawrence and the Arab forces entered Aqaba. The great guns that had guarded against naval attack stood silent and useless, pointing out to sea. The town fell almost without a fight. Hundreds of Turkish prisoners were taken. Supplies and ammunition were captured intact. It was a stunning victory. An impossible march across death-dealing desert, followed by a battle that broke enemy resistance completely. Lawrence allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The plan had worked even better than he had hoped. But there was no time for celebration. The Arab forces were nearly out of food. They needed British supplies immediately, or their victory would turn hollow. Someone had to carry news of the capture to Cairo. Someone had to arrange for ships to bring supplies. Lawrence volunteered to go himself. It would mean another brutal journey, this time across the Sinai Desert to the Suez Canal. He set out almost immediately, taking only a few companions. The crossing that awaited him would test even his legendary endurance. Aqaba was taken. Now the world had to know. The ride across the Sinai nearly killed Lawrence. He pushed through landscapes of sand and rock with barely any rest, driven by urgency. When he finally reached British headquarters in Cairo, he was sunburned, exhausted, and barely recognizable. His robes were torn and filthy. But the news he carried was electrifying. Aqaba had fallen. The impossible had been achieved. British commanders were stunned. They had written off any attack on Aqaba as too risky. Now, a young intelligence officer had delivered it without losing a single British soldier. Lawrence was promoted and decorated. His name began appearing in newspapers back in Britain. The legend of Lawrence of Arabia was being born. Ships were dispatched to Aqaba with supplies. The Arab Northern Army finally had a secure base from which to operate. General Edmund Allenby, the new British commander in Egypt, recognized Lawrence's value immediately. He gave the Arab forces a role in his planned offensive into Palestine. But Lawrence carried a burden that no metal could lift. He had made promises he was not sure Britain would keep. The Arabs trusted him. They had bled for his cause. What would happen when the war ended and the diplomats took over? That question would haunt him for years to come. The capture of Aqaba transformed the Arab revolt. What had been a struggling insurgency became a genuine military force operating alongside British armies. Over the next year, Arab fighters harassed Turkish communications and supply lines. They blew up trains on the Hejaz Railway. They tied down thousands of Ottoman troops who were needed elsewhere. When Allenby's forces advanced into Palestine and Syria, the Arabs protected his right flank. They captured towns and cut telegraph lines ahead of the main British advance. In October 1918, Arab forces entered Damascus. The revolt that had nearly died at Yanbu had achieved its greatest goal. Lawrence was there for the triumph, but he felt more sorrow than joy. He knew what was coming. The Sykes-Picot Agreement would be enforced. France would take Syria. Britain would take Palestine and Mesopotamia. Arab independence was a dream that would not come true. Lawrence returned to Britain a hero, but a broken one. He had pushed himself beyond human limits and kept promises that his government would not honor. His story became legend through books and eventually film, but the man himself never found peace. Aqaba remained his greatest achievement, a moment when courage and imagination overcame impossible odds. That, at least, could never be taken away.